Sengupta. This is Global Order. My guest today is joining from London. He's a lecturer in European Studies at King's College London. I invited Alexander Clarkson to have this conversation with me a couple of months ago, actually, when I first read a beautiful piece he wrote about how underdeveloped the relationship between India and Europe was. And I instinctively completely agreed with him that it was really underdeveloped and dangerously underdeveloped, considering how important the EU was to many things in India, including our strategic needs and indeed our economic basket. So I invited Alexander to talk to me and walk me through all of these issues as he sees it from his vantage point. Alexander, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Why don't we begin there, Alexander, if you don't mind? Talk us through why you think the India-Europe relationship is so underdeveloped. Why has it allowed to remain underdeveloped, and what can be done about this?
I think it's a perception that's problematic on both sides. I think on the EU side, Brexit had, the departure of the UK from the EU had a quite fundamental effect on what you would call the EU's strategic posture, the extent to which certain issues were of primary importance to European policymakers and less so. And so throughout the UK's membership of the EU, the UK was one of the driving forces in shaping relationships between India and the EU. Often, I think, to the detriment of the relationship as much as to the advantage, because of course there is all this imperial and neo-colonial baggage in that relationship that is now less so, at least in the case between the EU and India. So when the British departed, a substantial part of the expertise, a substantial part of the knowledge, a substantial part of the links and relationships, they didn't disappear. There's a lot of huge commercial and business relationships between the Germans, or the French, the Italians, and the Indian governments say. There is, of course, a very strong traditional relationship between Portugal and parts, at least Indian regional governments. But the interest kind of focus kind of left. And I think that was actually quite a bit of a problem, because if that's the very moment in time where it becomes increasingly clear that maybe India may not become a superpower, but it's so certainly going to become one of the 3 or 4 big global powers of our time. Obviously, the United States and China, then India, and then the EU in a slightly different way. But again, the EU has this massive concentration of geopolitical power. This is the big 4. And unless the EU develops a strategic posture, a particular set of relationship at all levels, an engagement not just with Delhi, but all the key regional governments as well, and did it on a collective scale. So each different member states have particular India strategies and particular connections. What the Commission, that's one of the central administrative bodies of the European Union, what the Commission, the European Parliament, the European Council, where all the different member state governments work together, but we can kind of the troika that runs the EU, that runs Europe. What they haven't done is really developed a more cohesive and concerted collective European policy and strategy towards India. Part of that would be defining what the interests are, what the foundation of the relationship should be, and how this should work, and where the areas of shared interest are. And I think that is particularly relevant in terms of trade routes, sea routes, economic modernization, and security in the Middle East. I think from the Indian perspective, I think a problem you often have had, and this isn't a BJP or a Congress point, I think this is a point of all Indian governments, have tended to have a 19th or mid-20th century vision of Europe. So there is an awareness, of course, in RAW or the Indian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there are a lot of people who understand how the EU works. So the Indian central bank, there's a lot of people who understand it very, very well. But among the political class, the people who set the agenda, and I think that, again, it's not so much a Congress or BJP issue, but there is a BJP element of like seeing Europe in a kind of a 19th century nation state dynamic. And if you do that, you don't really internalize how much of Europe is now run from Brussels, how much the economy, trade, now military industrial production is increasingly centralized to control in the hands of Brussels, although that's now happening because of the war in Ukraine. Border systems, migration, visa systems, the full gamut. There's even, I mean, if you look at it in terms of the rights and freedoms different EU citizens have, there's a kind of a concept of European citizenship that now exists, because you have certain rights within a kind of citizenship hierarchy. And I would say the Indian civil service understands this very well. Indian diplomats, bankers, the financial, but the political class doesn't really get that if you want stuff done, and if you want to build a lasting strategic relationship, the EU matters. And so I think there's a lack of any sense of the EU, of the importance. I think it's maybe changing now a little bit, but there was, for a couple of years, a lack of focus on the EU side. And in the Indian side, I often find there's often engagement at the wrong level, right? They think if you go to Berlin or you go to Paris, that will fix your problems with the Europeans. And this is how important it is that you really have to keep talking to the Commission day in, day out, because they're the people who call the shots. And I think as a final point, why do I think this is dangerously underdeveloped? I think they're on two levels. First of all, both India and the EU are faced with similar strategic dilemmas, the rise of China and a potential decline of the United States. And I'm not saying, I think the EU has gotten very lucky that we have the Biden administration with the war in Ukraine, because they've been able to surge US power again. I don't think there's necessarily a guarantee that the Biden administration, that US power stays in the same level after the Biden administration. This may be the last hurrah. Economically, they'll do fine, but whether they want to play that global role anymore is an issue. And we can already see this in the Middle East. And this is where you see a convergence of EU interests over trade routes, sea routes, the Gulf. We've often, both as Indians and Europeans, relied on the Americans to run security in the Middle East. Not that we should do it in the same way, but that has worked to the interests of both. And there's a whole set of other issues where if the Americans fall away and the Chinese keep pushing, that isn't necessarily in the same interest. Finally, I don't necessarily think this will ever be like an emotional friendly alliance. This is transactional. The EU and India are operating on different political and social systems. They have diverging interests in other issues and matters. And as long as there's realism about that, which I think you'll have that more in Europe than necessarily the United States, that this is transactional, then you can have a stable long-term relationship.
I want to ask you, and we'll get into many of the issues that you just pointed out, but I want to begin by asking you also, in the G20 that India just hosted, it was a big announcement of a corridor that connects Europe to India, passing through the Middle East. And that's been talked about in India and other parts of the world even today. What do you think of this idea?
I think it's primarily symbolic. I think, look, if it helps build some infrastructure and develop relationships more strongly, if it's a sign that there's finally a kind of in dailies recognize that you have to, if you want for anything geoeconomic and increasingly also geopolitical, you have to work through Brussels, because it's in Brussels that where you don't just deal with the French or the Germans, all the other 27 states of the EU are all there, and you can then negotiate and engage with them. If that leads to an intensified geoeconomic relationship, that's great. I think realistically, I'm just personally a skeptic about the extent to which these big sort of infrastructure projects ever really hang together coherently. However, as I think in a sense, what was kind of secondary to that meeting, so I'm not sure these corridors will ever really work out in the way I imagined. But a secondary aspect of that meeting was actually, I thought interesting, was there was a discussion about how to secure the corridors. And to me, that was more, okay, so we have these kind of pie in the sky, grand transport plans. They look great on the PowerPoint. But the discussions were also about how do we mutually ensure that these trade routes between Europe, India, and then further off to East Asia, that these are secured. And how can we ensure in mutual interest through joint naval patrols off the Somali coast, through joint consultation about developments in the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, depending which side you are on that geographical descriptor. That kind of conversation, not just about these infrastructure corridors, but the security around them, I think is a more profitable and more a discussion that if it develops in terms of trade-driven security cooperation, is one that I think matters more. So I think, yeah, there'll be some great infrastructure development. That'll build relationships. Both sides were clearly in their 8 or 9 months before that beginning to talk to each other in a more strategic way, which I thought was a good sign. We need more of that, which is the point of the piece I wrote, to encourage that kind of thinking, at least in Brussels. And I think beyond that, though, there is this other issue that the infrastructure is fine, but if you cannot run ships through this choke point between Europe and India, because Egypt collapses economically, that's entirely possible in the next couple of years, because of another surge of piracy, because of the Yemen war, because the Americans, they want to sort of influence developments in the region, but are less and less interested in it, really. Because the Chinese kind of want to exert power, but not necessarily in Indian or European interests, but also the Chinese haven't got the power to act as guarantors. You have this difficult relationship with Iran and Saudi Arabia. All of that consultation about this really basic geoeconomic security problem for both sides. That if this initiative leads to that, and there were parts of that that did refer to that, then I think something beneficial could come out of it.
The reasons why, you earlier mentioned that one of the perhaps from an Indian vantage point, there is less of an understanding that you have to deal with Brussels, and the Indians think perhaps you could deal with Paris, and
Yeah.
you could deal with Berlin, and so on and so forth, and some of these issues would get sorted. And that actually, what you're saying is right. I mean, look at India's relationship with France, for instance, which seems to be strengthening with each passing year,
Yeah.
with Italy now increasingly, and so on and so forth. One of the reasons for that is perhaps some people in India believe that, especially after Brexit, the EU as a project, there's a question mark on the project itself. You certainly don't seem to think that. Uh, Talk to me a little bit about this feeling that seems to have gathered steam in some parts of the world, especially in Asia, that, well, the long term validity, in a sense, of the EU project is questionable.
So this leads to an interesting problem. This is an academic, I call it a discourse problem, in that one of the big problems in the global perception of the European Union is the language most people speak and read about Europe is English, which is a language that people use as a lingua franca within Europe, but a lot of European debate happens in French, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, and so on. And the great bulk of the media space, that particularly of the 2010s, so it's between the great global financial crisis to Brexit and the pandemic, the main media outlets people were reading in English about Europe were British. So what the rest of the world got was a British perspective on Europe. And particularly in the build-up to the Brexit referendum, but as well as afterwards, there was a very London, Britain-centric narrative about potential EU collapse. Now, that's not to say that the crises the EU faced, particularly the Eurozone crisis between 2010, 2009, and 2015, that was the EU's near-death experience, right? That was the moment when there were a couple of 2 or 3 tricky moments, 2009, 2012, 11, the whatever it takes speech by Draghi, the head of ECB at the time, and the 2015 confrontation with the Greek government. Those were the near-death experiences. But they are now, I wouldn't say resolved, because every system or every state always has its vulnerabilities. But that phase is in the past. And I think there was the net result, which was very much felt within the EU, was not the EU gets weaker, but the classic phrase, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The response to it was to make Brussels stronger. The ECB comes out of it, the central bank, with more power. The Commission came out of the migration crises, the response to the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, with far more power. The European Parliament has far more legislative power since the 2009 Lisbon Treaty, and begins using it seriously at the end of the Juncker Commission, before he was replaced by the current head of the Commission, President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. And every step of the way with Brexit, there was a centralization of trade, a further centralization of trade and geopolitical negotiation powers. So there was a further centralization of geopolitical negotiation powers. And people are aware of that in the EU. Actually, what you're beginning to see is far-right parties that once wanted the breakup of the EU doing a shift to saying, actually, no, we will keep the euro. Instead, what we'll use the EU for, and this is, of course, also dangerous, is a fortress Europe. We will become more powerful, and so there's a kind of, almost in some far parts of the far right in Europe, a transfer of nationalism and racism from the nationalist level to a supranationalist European, which is of course also dangerous and problematic, but it does give you a sense of the direction of travel ideologically in this period. And I think some UK outlets have begun to realize this. And you can also notice that people who used to write about the coming death of the EU are now writing about the EU as a racist project, which there is elements of that undoubtedly to parts of some movements and some figures and some institutions of the EU, or the EU as Fortress Europe, or the EU as a bully, right? And so, I think part of this problem is that you're reading about this in English from a British perspective that was always skeptical about the project and believed, and it really, I think there's a lot of people in the UK who call themselves Remainers, i.e. pro-EU now, or call themselves, or who are sort of liberal leavers, or say now that they're not anti-EU. There's a lot of liberals in Britain, never mind the right, who were profoundly Eurosceptic between 2010, 2015, with some reason, because the Eurozone crisis was a disaster. And you look back to that then shapes how the world sees the EU. So I think that if we go back to India, I can totally understand that if you're in Indian media sphere, India has its own problems, its own domestic developments and politics. I can totally understand. I mean, nobody has the bandwidth to go into the level of detail that Europeans will go about their own politics. I can totally get that if you're reading British papers and journalists and looking at this, you will assume this thing is collapsing just actually when it gets stronger.
I'm smiling because this is actually a problem for India also, that a lot of people around the world read The Economist and the Financial Times to find out what's happening about India and the Guardian, depending on where they stand. Whereas they may not be the best, vehicles to try and explain the world, explain to the world about India. I want to ask you another question. I'm fascinated by the point you just made about EU becoming stronger, and even right-wing parties really sort of gathering together and now saying, let's not break up this project, let's make it stronger. And the examples that spring to mind, of course, are countries like Poland. In the recent past, all the things that the Poles have been saying, and before that, of course, Hungary. Even in Germany, there are recent reports about how AfD, their far right, in a sense, party, many of their leaders are being attacked in a sense. What's really going on in that space, in the sort of European right at the moment, according to you? And what's what if there's been a mindset shift, how has that happened?
So I think what you're seeing in the European far right is two conflicting dynamics. And one of the problems, I actually wrote about this quite recently, is in itself to say the European far right is all one group with one belief set. And actually you're seeing parts of it go in one direction and parts of it go in another. So the German AfD is a good case in point. The German AfD, partly because it has a strong anchoring in certain social movements that wants to, let's put it quite brutally, take back bits of Poland. Right, so there's a part of that party that is profoundly irredentist and profoundly far right, and also sees Germany as the net payer. So they want sort of a nationalist model that is just completely incompatible with the European Union. So that party, and you can find other parties like that in a lot of the EU states. So that's one version of the far right that remains nationalist and anti-EU. So that's still there. That's not disappeared. There are, however, other far-right parties that have begun to transition from that nationalism to the notion of, it's also a sense of a different kind of narrative. So if you look at the far right in Italy, the FDI. So the FDI is the current governing party in Italy. And everybody expected Giorgia Meloni when she took over and the party to do what, push against the EU. No, they've been very happy they've actually embraced integration in certain places. Because partly, again, there's a kind of a racist civilizationalism. It's the notion that we're Italians, but also Europeans, but then you can build in the racism quite happily because you then say, well, then all these other people from outside of our collective European borders, they're the outsiders. And you identify Romanians are fellow Latins, or French are fellow Latins, or Spanish fellow Latins, and so on. And a wider kind of civilizational discourse of Christian Europe. This is why it's so dangerous also for Europe itself. This idea that, okay, if we can't survive as nation states because we're too small, let's come together and build a more powerful shared entity to defend Christianity in Europe, right? And Christian Europe. It's a very far right view. But on the other hand, that's perfectly compatible with whole slices of EU integration. The interesting thing about Orbán is he kind of falls in between. Right, so there is an irredentist elements to Hungarian nationalist ideology. They want to take back so-called Hungarian territory from Romania and Slovakia. So that works against the EU, and his own power base is built on riling that up. But to a different, and also the far right in Hungary is also split. So a different far right audience in Hungary, he also pitches himself as we must work together to defend Christian Europe against those who attack this very far right understanding of Christianity in Europe. That's our internal enemy and the external enemy. Right, so I think Orbán's interesting because he's sort of halfway in that transition. The far right in France now also says it won't get rid of the euro, but you can see the splits in France. So Le Pen is drifting more and more to this kind of, well, okay, Fortress Europe. There is a new party called Reconquête under Zemmour and the niece of, because it's a family business, that is still very nationalist exclusivist. Right, so the far right itself is splitting over this in a lot of Europe, and that's actually also an interesting kind of underlying dynamic, where it gets less and less straightforward. I just personally, because of my own views in political background, I dislike deeply both versions, but there are two versions now. It's not one thing anymore. And in a sense, that means that a lot of ideological movements that would have been united in hating the EU have split over it because the EU survived. and has more
Interesting.
power. And power is attractive to any
Tell
movement.
me, one of the things that was supposed to damage the EU, and that in that and that issue, in a sense, connects the EU with Asia too, was really immigration. You know, only a few months ago there was talk about how inflation was hurting many people in Europe so badly that food delivery services, cheap, low cost food delivery services had become the biggest business in some parts of Europe. Also, the Poles constantly talk about, and others, that, oh, we have no terrorist incidents in our country because we never opened our borders. And with Twitter, we see all these videos of how their borders work. Germany, of course, and Sweden opened its borders, and today many people say that the gang wars that happen in Malmo and so on and so forth are a result of that. To talk to us a little bit about this issue of immigration, which now actually impacts America as much as it impacts Europe. So it has really spread. What do you think are the views? Is there a collective European view to this? Is there a Brussels view to this? How is this being seen?
So there is a Brussels view to this, and it actually sort of reflects. This is interesting because the dynamics are increasingly harmonized between different bits of the EU. So these discourses, they may have different versions, but they're increasingly running to the same tune. And this tune is one of profound contradictions. So on the one hand, you have, and really the 2015 experience was a profound shock, but 2015 only makes sense if you think of 2015, that big moment of Syrian migration, other groups from that, when the collective border control system broke down, which by the way led to stronger EU powers, right? When the collective border control system broke down, and there was a sense of loss of control, and different EU states reacted in different ways, and Brussels had to sort of bring it all together driven by a deal between the Greeks and the Germans, and then negotiated with the Turks. So this is still the image that we have. And there was a kind of, again, a dual response, what we would call broadly liberal Europe, but that includes also a lot of center-right parties, were welcoming, right? They said these people have no choice, they're victims of war, and so on. But the language is welcoming as a one-off. We let them in, and then we shut the borders again. That's what was forget. The borders did not remain open. Where the borders remained open was within Europe, but that's the foundation of the EU. The removal of the borders between EU countries were largely removed in 1994, right? So that's quite a long time ago now. But what's happened is so that you have this really discourse of if the EU is supposed to survive, we have to rigidly control the EU's outer borders, particularly if we want to ensure that the removal of internal borders maintains public support, and we maintain a strong sense of European identity. So yeah, there's this far right fortress Europe. But on the other hand, most EU countries, even East European countries, are suffering from severe labor shortages in key sectors. So there's a huge demand for migrants. Poland is the classic case. On one level, the Poles say, and there was a similar mini crisis for the Belarus border, and possibly a Russian op just before the war, but it was also involved genuine migrants who flew via Minsk to cross, and they shut those borders down. They're defending those borders. So on the other hand, the Polish government will say, we want, at most we'll want European migrants. So there's about 1 million Ukrainians there before the war, by the way. There was already a huge wave of Ukrainian migration before the 2022 invasion, before the war escalated in 2022. But at the same time, if you look at the figures, there are a growing number of Nepalese workers, Filipino workers in Poland, even workers from Muslim nations, Muslim backgrounds, despite all the PIS's government's claims, because they're just running out of people to fill key parts of the economy. Because if you look at the Central and Eastern European states or the South European states like Italy, that are often on one level the most anti-migrant, on another level, they experienced two things in the last 40 years. First of all, massively declining birth rates and a huge outward migration of their own populations to North and Western Europe. So a substantial number of Poles between the 90s and the noughts went to Germany and then to Britain. Well, there's this huge outward migration. There's a huge outward Italian migration from the 1950s onwards, just as when their birth rates go down. So on the one hand, you have this language of anti-migration, which is deeply racist, unfortunately is recognizable. At the same time, we have never had as high legal levels of migration to Poland and Italy than in the last 3 or 4 years with the blip of the pandemic. Even Romania, which used to be considered one of the poorest parts of the EU, is actually catching up very quickly. It's becoming very prosperous very quickly. Even Romania has imported something like 100,000 migrants in the last year from Nepal, Vietnam, all of these places that are now going to become Romanians because they're
Well,
not in the
that's
UK.
incredible because one remembers as if it was only yesterday that the British were complaining about too many Romanians coming to work in the UK and taking away British jobs. The British press used to talk about this and so on and so forth. It's fascinating. I want to ask you, um, from in
Yes.
all of this, in all of this, a volatile mix in Europe, how
Mm.
do you think Europe hopes to engage India? Because we read the European sort of Indo-Pacific strategy. How successful do you think, or how successfully do you think it's being implemented? What are the lessons do you think the Europeans could have learned in this entire imbroglio between India and Canada, where after the Ukraine war, there seems to be a lot of chatter about whether India is really on our side or not. We were talking about this right before the conversation began. How do you see Europe look at India?
I think what we have to consider is that, and I do think actually in this sense, opinion in Brussels and some of the other EU capitals is more realistic than, say, in the United States or the UK. That this is primarily a transactional relationship. Like these are, on both levels, democracies, although you can have democratic rollback in a liberal democracy, and that those trends you can find in parts of the EU as well as in India. But ultimately, there might be some system similarities. There is a shared history, not just with the UK, of course. I think one of the most interesting partners for India and the EU is Portugal, for obvious reasons, because Goa and Antonio Costa, the Prime Minister himself, and Ireland, of course, as well, not just because of the Taoiseach, but Taoiseach's background, but also because of long cultural and social relations. But I think one thing you will say in Brussels is nobody has any illusions about, or had any illusions before the Ukraine war, really, that there aren't whole areas of policy where there will just be disagreement and where there will be divergent. And I think a more stable relationship between two societies that are maybe the number three and the number four of what would be the big four. Well, we obviously the US and China and primacy. After that, it's the Europeans and the Indians, or the Indians and Europeans, depending on how you frame it. It's a more stable relationship. It's based on this realistic understanding of where the limits are, right? And of the fact that, okay, there might be shared interests in terms of competition with China, or infrastructure build, or securing trade routes between both sides, or stability in the Middle East, particularly if the Americans play less and less of a role there. But there will just be policy areas on the Indian diaspora, for example, that will be difficult. Like, I mean, there's a Sikh diaspora in Germany as well. There are relations between some EU states and Pakistan that will involve complications. There are arms sales and arms deals. There will be competition between EU banks and firms and Indian banks and companies. That's just life, right? And I think as long as there's a degree of honesty here, and also the fact that the Indians will have to live with cases where the EU sits down and says, that we have certain founding principles of the European Union that also involve human rights clauses, and the EU will be critical about things like Kashmir. I think that's just going to happen, or other issues to do with human rights in India. India will be critical about the EU's neo-colonial relationships with the states in Africa. Also fair cop, frankly. That will be. If everybody is clear that there are going to be points of difficulty and friction, there will be differences in interest, the cooperation, intensified cooperation in those areas where those interests are shared can be more stable, right? Because you can sort of silo things and say, okay, here we work together, here we'll disagree. That's life. Rather than trying to force some kind of civilizational alliance or strategic, like, let's be like NATO together. That's just not going to happen. I do think there's more realism about that in the EU. I think where the people are going to be disappointed about that more is the United States. Because I think the Americans tend to assume that shared suspicion of China automatically means India is on America's side. And I think that's really, really unrealistic. But as long as both Indian side and the EU side have that realism, it's fine. I think I wouldn't compare it with the Canadian-Indian relationship. And Canada is a society that is very, very shaped by diaspora politics, more so than most countries. Canada's an immigrant country. There's also the indigenous peoples in Canada, but they all have their own political networks. The way Canadian politics work, not just between Francophone and Anglophones, but if you think of the fact that Canada has about 2 million Ukrainian Canadians, that's a hugely influential community, a huge Haitian community, huge Chinese community, and a huge Sikh community. And so that they are going to lock down control of through because they're concentrated in certain seats. They will be an electoral force. That's not going to be an issue in terms of EU-India relations. I mean, there's no concentration. There's a big Indian diaspora in the EU, but not concentrated in a way that would determine decisions in UCO. That would change potentially if the UK rejoined, but that's not happening in the next decade, right? So I think in those circumstances, that issue, I think, is less salient.
I'm going to ask you if you thought the UK was going to rejoin the EU anytime soon, but you already answered that. So let me ask you one last question. And you could add some of your thoughts about the UK joining or rejoining as an answer to this question too. We spoke through this entire conversation about many challenges in many parts of the world, and challenges between Europe and India. But between Europe and India, in your opinion, what are the top three, what are the one or two things that are low-hanging places where we could cooperate better, but the two regions are not cooperating enough?
So India and the French Navy, for example, had a joint exercise in the Indian Ocean. France has a big territorial presence over a set of chains of islands in the Pacific, so it's easier to do that. But I think enhanced and expanded regular military cooperation focused on specific tasks with the almost open strategic goal of being able to replace the Americans if they're out. I think this is one of the low-hanging areas where it's what you call contingency planning. Like both the Indians and the EU would probably rather the Americans did all of this and covered these basics, trade route and security tasks that we need to keep goods flowing between both sides. But there may be a scenario where the Americans can't or won't. So there is a lot of scope for much greater, not just symbolic exercises like the French and Indian exercise where they just work together and sort of demonstrate that was more of a diplomatic exercise, but just simply day-to-day routine coordination and planning. In case something happens and the Americans aren't there to clean up the mess, or the Americans create a mess and they won't clean it up. Right? I think that's the first thing, is simply a much greater level of military contact and cooperation. I think that there's a lot more scope to do that. And to build links that aren't just symbolic and diplomatic, but routine. That's a different thing. Like there's a lot of military diplomacy. I'm not talking about military diplomacy. I'm talking about military contact systems and structures and logistics systems and communication systems, and not just generals knowing each other, but colonels and majors and captains and lieutenants, or command. So that level of mutual knowledge, and that would help mutual understanding as well, right? That if there was a lot more of this kind of contact in terms of just joint planning. I think that's just low-hanging fruit. That's just something you could do, right? And it could happen in the background. And it's like having a bear spray, in a Canadian camp. Like you don't necessarily need to use it ever, but it's good to have, right? And that's and that also creates strong cooperation. I think also I would focus less on grand infrastructure products that look great in a PowerPoint presentation, and focus on the logistics and sea routes as they exist. If you look at the whole business of global logistics and transport is actually a European and East Asian game. It's European logistics firms run about 40 to 60% of the global market is run by European logistics firms on East Asian ships. And I think there's certainly a lot of scope there for India, rather than to create new stuff, to go to where the business is and logistics is, and to build stronger business partnerships between European logistics firms, and India is expanding in this space, right? So rather than just creating new infrastructure, looking where the trade is and how it functions, and just enhancing business and commercial cooperation around already existing nodes of trade. I think that's the other thing. So I think in that sense, it's not just about this specific issue of about how do we think of these trade corridors. I think rather than trying to build new stuff, let's just enhance cooperation over things that already exist. Right, and then see out of what can grow out of that instead. That comes back to my skepticism about all these great PowerPoint slides about new railway routes, and that's fine. But let's just take a look at how trade works now. Let's take a look at how your Indian firms could help enhance or work or be profitable or become a partner in that space. And the final point is the India and the EU operate in very distinct and often very protectionist markets. For good reason. Sometimes protectionism is good. I'm a bit of a heretic on that front, right? But sometimes it's perfectly sensible. You know, the economist might say, you must open your markets. It's perfectly sensible for India to say, no way, right? There's some pretty good reasons why India is protectionist in some areas. Same with the EU, by the way. But there is, if you want to build up that partnership, I think there is a lot of scope on one level in terms of financial services and industrial supply chains, of simplifying a lot of contact a lot more. And that's where India is very conservative about free trade agreements. And then on the other hand, on a civil society and trade union level, also building up contacts between trade unions and civil society, particularly in the industrial worker sector or the agricultural and financial services sectors, so that when that opening happens, you don't get a particular European backlash of, oh, this is Indian dumping and so on. You want to build in the trade unions from the start and say, no, there'll be equal labor practices and standards. Because actually, India will find, if you bring in the European trade unions quite early on, it's much easier later on in terms of getting something through the European Parliament.
And I don't think a lot of Indians understand this last point that you made. But because you mentioned protectionism, I cannot but ask you this one final question, which is there is a lot of concern in India about new European green laws, CBAM, for instance, right? And whether laws like this are essentially, in a sense, protectionist weaponization of the sort of the green structure to ensure that goods and services don't flood European markets, so to speak, from a country like India.
Of course they are. Of course they are. Of course they're a protectionist instrument. They're both an environmental instrument. They are that, but they're also a protectionist instrument. This comes back to the point I made earlier on, and maybe this what I'm skeptical of is the particular plans set up about this new EU-India logistics cooperation. I think a lot of that's pie in the sky. Let's just focus on what exists and build it out from there. But this is a point of criticism. This was India assuming that you talk to Berlin and you talk to Paris, problem solved. And CBAM is this train that's been building for a decade. Like, everybody could see it coming. And it's not just the Indians. The Americans didn't talk to the Commission enough. Right? And the Americans, the big mistake the Americans made, I'm less aware of what the Indians did, was to not take the European Parliament seriously. Because yes, it can't initiate a lot of legislation, but certainly to get a lot of stuff through, you now have to get it through this collective European Parliament, which was a joke up until 2009. But 2009 was an empowering moment for it. Now it can block everything. So what you have then is there was a lack of engagement with the MEPs, the MPs in the European Parliament, a lack of engagement, and also this is actually a mutual problem, that India is obviously a much more centralized state than the EU, but still a very federalized state. If you want to get stuff done in India, you can't just go to Delhi. You have to go to all the provincial governments and negotiate. Same the other way, by the way. If India wants to get anything done, its embassy in Bratislava, say Slovakia, or in Lisbon, or in Dublin, obviously will not be quite as important as the embassies in Rome, Berlin, Paris, and Warsaw. But you want anything done, you have to have a line to every EU government, because any one of those EU governments can block either in the Parliament through their MEPs or in Europe, UCO. So I think beyond that, the CBAM issue was one that if India had been on the ground, in some ways the Chinese knew this better. I mean, the Chinese didn't really win out, but the Chinese did really push on every level because they knew you had to push on every level. So there are ways of negotiating and reconfiguring CBAM to India's interest, but India also has to make an offer. But you have to do that. You have to go through a set of complex steps, right? But on the other hand, if the Indians say from perspective, this is protectionist, yes, it is protectionist. I'm not going to pretend it's anything else than that. But that is what it is. And there are ways of getting around that, but that does involve engagement with the EU as a structure, and the fact that it's not just 4 big countries, it's every one of those countries that you have to talk to.
Very well explained, Alexander Clarkson. Thank you very much for your time and explaining all these complicated issues to us. Here's hoping for more engaged India-Europe cooperation that takes into account all the nuances that you spoke about. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me.